It was pretty extraordinary because the founder even admitted to me through the investment process in a very egoless way, as if to acknowledge they weren't sure how long they would be the right CEO for the company. And I totally interpreted that as no lack of ambition or no lack of commitment to the company, but instead a real acknowledgement of ambition, like they wanted to build a huge company.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession Podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs navigating the critical decision. Should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shadchnev. In each episode, we will examine the challenges, strategies, and success stories of leadership transitions in the startup world. Whether you're a founder considering your next move, a professional CEO ready to take over, or an investor navigating the process, join us as we uncover insights that will help you steer your company towards a successful future. Today, I'm speaking with Rory Stirling. Rory is a partner at Connect Ventures, a product-focused investment firm based in London and investing across Europe. Connect Ventures invests in opinionated products, crafted with love and loved by many. In his 15-year career as an investor, Rory has seen his fair share of CEO successions. Today we are going to discuss the lessons he took out of his experience, and also what it's like for him to hear that a founder he backed is considering stepping down. We will also talk about why founders should not feel guilty if they're about to deliver this news to their investors, and also why discussing a potential CEO succession is not necessarily a red flag at the fundraising stage. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, Rory. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. Rory, we've got a big topic to discuss. What makes conversations between investors and founders so difficult when it comes to the topic of founder CEO potentially stepping down?
Well, your book made me think about this a lot. And if I think about the advice that I would give to founders in this situation, it's tricky because I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach, which is why your book does such a great job of articulating so many of the subjects that a founder needs to think about. But I think in direct answer to your question, why it's so difficult, my model of a founder when building a startup is that they're at the center of this circle, and around the circle they build all of these stakeholders, and it starts from day zero or day -1. Let's say a founder has a partner at home and they're persuading their partner that it's the right thing to do for them to quit their job and start a company. It then moves on to their co-founder, their first employees, their first investors, their first suppliers, their first customers. All of those people have a vested interest in the company. And the founder does this extraordinary thing of holding those stakeholders' expectations and, for the most part, selling and persuading those people that this future vision of the company that they're going to build can and will exist. And on a good day, I think that feels incredible because you feel supported and everyone has this vested interest in the company. On the bad days, when you have self-doubt about what you're building and something's gone wrong, it can feel extremely hard because you're holding all these people's expectations about a future that doesn't yet exist. So I think the reason it's so difficult to have the conversation is as soon as you open that door, even a crack, and allude to the fact that you don't think you're the right CEO to lead this company, it's really difficult psychologically to row back from that. And I mean that both in theory, I think that's why it's so difficult to have the conversation. And I also sadly mean it in practice.
So it feels really scary that even if either the founder or someone on the board starts the conversation, it will be the crack that opens the topic and then it will almost make it irreversible.
Yeah, I think that's the theory. And I think it's that fear that once you start the conversation, it ends up, you may not be sure about wanting to leave the company. I think a lot of people or founders will have this thought process, but certainly haven't made up their mind yet. But they feel like they need to make up their mind fully in private before having that conversation with anyone who's connected to the company because it's so scary to do so. And I really, I respect that. I understand why it's scary.
Yeah. And I imagine the same process happens on both sides. If an investor is having any doubts about whether a different CEO would be beneficial for the company, they will have every reason to think it through very, very carefully before starting a conversation with the existing CEO.
It's true, but I'm smiling because I think it reminds me that it might be the same on the investor side, but like everything in building startups, it's just more difficult for the founder. Like you think about it from an investor side, there are ways in which an investor can almost certainly have side conversations with other board members or other shareholders about their concerns without fear of judgment or without fear of that information being shared with the CEO. But I think there are ways to constructively have that conversation without effectively saying that you've lost confidence in the founder CEO. So as most things in this case, it's imbalanced. I think it's more difficult for the founder than it is for the investor.
Yeah. But it sounds like the way to approach this conversation, what I'm hearing between the lines, is not by jumping straight to the topic, but by building a trusted relationship way before you need it.
Yeah, well, you tell me. You're the master, of asking great questions and building relationships. But yeah, like almost certainly, it's the joy of the job. I think it's why I love doing what I do, which is you get to build these really meaningful partnerships and relationships over time with founders, and you have to earn the right to that trust. Our industry is not well known for well-rounded individuals, even on the founder side or the investor side. It's full of personalities and characters. So I think it really depends on who it is and what their style is.
Yeah. And you mentioned that in your 15-year career, you had a number of really positive conversations about this difficult topic. What were the conditions that enabled those conversations to happen?
God, such a great question. I really mean what I said. I believe they were great processes, great conversations, and when people ask me about the great moments of investing, interestingly, it's not typically around those LinkedIn highlights of selling a company or whatever it happens to be. It's instead those moments when you get the call first from a founder who has something to share. It's bad news or perceived bad news, and they trust you to have that conversation. Those are the moments I look back on with pride, for sure. And some of these founder CEO transitions absolutely fall into that bucket. So there was one very early in my career, which I still look back on with great pride, if you like. And even before, when we were investing in that founding team, it was pretty extraordinary because the founder even admitted to me through the investment process in a very egoless way, as if to acknowledge that they didn't have they basically said that they weren't sure how long they would be the right CEO for the company. And I totally interpreted that as no lack of ambition or no lack of commitment to the company, but instead a real acknowledgement of ambition. Like they wanted to build a huge company. I wanted to found a huge company and be part of building it. But to do that, they acknowledged that they may not be able to transition or grow into the right CEO for that company. And I really respected them for that because it was their truth. I think it had some real wisdom in it, and it was dealt with in the right way. So they planted the seed when making the investment in the right way, and it happened to be about, I would say, a year and a half, maybe 2 years later. And I think, although my memory is a little bit hazy on this, that I can't remember whether I prompted this conversation, but I think because the founder had planted that seed in my mind, I'd always checked in as I normally would with a founder, before having an update on the company itself. I would talk to them about how they were doing. I strongly believe that you can't build successful companies without successful individuals leading them. And, so I think it's really important to have that check-in, and hopefully earn the right to their trust, which means they can share openly with you. And so I think I had done that and maybe asked them quite a pointed question around how they were feeling about their position. And I don't think it was in that conversation, but it was in one a few weeks later, or maybe a couple of months later. Again, my memory is a bit hazy here, where they said that they'd really been thinking about the topic of how long they were the right CEO for the company, and had come to the conclusion that they didn't believe they were anymore, and there was no rush for them to leave. In fact, they didn't even want to leave the company. There was no rush for them to step down as CEO, but they felt the best thing for building value in the company was to go through a process of finding a professional CEO to lead the company. And that started a process or a conversation over, and actually it was a 12-month process in the end. We just took one step at a time. I'd never been through it. I hope, although I can't specifically remember, that I reacted well in that moment. I think I did, because the founder and I still acknowledge it as a good process. But I'd clearly earned the right to their trust in that early conversation, and then we just dealt with the right steps to. And at the end, we got an incredible CEO, and the founders of that company stayed in that company, working with that CEO for many years after that.
Yeah.
It was and they built an incredible company.
So it sounds like there are a few really important points here. The conversation really started years before at the fundraising stage, when the founder was open about their concerns about how long they would stay in their role, and you did not take it as a red flag. You saw it as a sign of maturity. And
I
over the
absolutely
years,
did. Yeah, and I think the way that the founder had done it, I'm pretty sure that any investor or in that situation would have interpreted it the same way. And I know your audience may be thinking about, okay, so what is the right way to bring that topic up without, and as I said, without it being perceived as lacking in commitment or lacking ambition. So let's just think about that for a second. I think there's nothing better than a founder who clearly has the growth mindset or the desire to want to go the full journey. So if somebody says to me, I would love to become, the CEO of this scaling company and be CEO all the way through, and I really want to work on becoming that, but then just leaving a chink of, or the door open slightly to acknowledge the reality that is building a company from nothing is extraordinarily hard and against all odds. And being the founder CEO of that company for the life of that company is even rarer. So let's just confront the numbers on that and acknowledge the fact that the company at some point becomes bigger than the founding team, and that point is relatively early in the company's journey. If you think about it, I always have this. I think about this spectrum or this time journey where at the beginning, literally the company would not exist without the founders. There is this embryonic stage where the company is the founders. And then because of venture capital funding, you're able to build a team, and you've got all these kind of resources around the founders. But interestingly, there's still a period of time where the company doesn't have product market fit. And if the founders walked away, the company would just sort of very quickly implode on itself. Like, building something from nothing is not easy, as we both know. But at some point, and I'm pretty convinced it's beyond product market fit or strong product market fit, there is a point at which the company would survive and could thrive under different leadership. And coming back to my original point, I think it is about clearly being ambitious for the company and for yourself as a founder CEO, and be willing to go on that growth journey. Clearly being authentically committed to that journey. I think I speak for a lot of VCs, or most VCs, when it's like a massive sort of red flag when you meet a founder who talks about a quick flip on a company, or building a company quickly and selling it. Like, it's just not what we're in the business of doing. So staying pretty clear of that narrative, but acknowledging that there is this chance that the company becomes bigger than the individual founder, and at some point it may not be appropriate for that for that person to be the CEO of the company.
So the message that ideally you want to hear from the founder at the fundraising stage is that I am very ambitious, I am very committed, and I accept that there might be a possibility that the company will grow bigger than my skill set. In this situation, the right thing to do will be to bring in an external CEO.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, given that people are listening to this and taking it as advice, the first bit of what you just said is not surprising to anyone. Of course, building a venture scale company, you want someone who's ambitious and committed, unrealistically so, right? The next part, though, is around, and I don't believe this is a necessary condition. So in some cases, I absolutely back founders who are, what's the famous expression for it? Like the reality distortion field. Like, they've just got blinkers on, and they are going to build this company no matter what, and they are going to be the founder, the CEO of this company for as long as it takes. And that narrative is also totally fine if that's authentic to the founder. What I'm saying is, in this specific case that I'm talking about, the founder had very delicately and very well opened the door to the fact they were self-aware enough that they were a technical founder CEO. They may not have the skills to grow into the CEO that leads this company to the scale at which they wanted to build it. And I didn't see that as a red flag or a bad thing. I totally saw it as a sign of maturity and realism about what it takes to build a company.
Yeah. So an acknowledgement that the job of a founder CEO evolves significantly as the company grows, and what is necessary or what is required of a founder at an early stage is not going to be the same when the company is 50 or 100 people with a solid product market fit.
Yeah, and to give you a counterexample on that, like one of the most, and I'll name him because I think it's a tremendous compliment. But Timo, who's the founder CEO of Gusto, I remember very early in that journey just being really clear that his role as CEO of a scaling company was going to change every 6 months, and it was his job to make sure that he was prepared for what that role was going to look like in 6 months' time, and constantly reskill himself. It was the most extraordinary growth mindset I've ever seen, and to the extent where he did an executive MBA whilst also building the company, And as you and I both know, our industry, the beauty of it is it's full of extraordinary people who do incredible things that I don't think are going to be possible. But never bet against the founder. Yeah.
And speaking of the role of the founder, how do you think about the importance of the founder for the company's success? Or more specifically, some investors make an argument that founder-led companies have an intrinsic advantage because founders have something unique they can bring to the table, and this can compensate for whatever might be missing in their skill set.
Yeah. Well, let's break that down, and bear in mind for this conversation that I'm a seed stage investor. So we're always backing founder-led companies, and we're always really working with founder-led companies for the majority of our time with a company. I think the argument you make about some investors saying that founder-led companies have an advantage is more to do with the narrative of late-stage companies, and specifically to do with the fact that they can, when the founder has control, they can take decisions or take risks or have insights that an external professional CEO that comes in may not be able to have with a different set of incentives and frankly a different set of governance. But let's come back to the early stage, because that's where most of my experience is, and I think that's where your question really lies. I think the founder is more important in early stage and scaling companies for far longer than we think they are. But, and there is a but here, I think you have to be able to hold two things in your mind, potentially conflicting sounding things in your mind at the same time. I think the founder is more valuable to a company for longer than we think they are. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the best or the right CEO for the company at every stage. So what do I mean by that? If I take that example that I gave you of the successful CEO transition, I really believed that founder needed to stay in the company. They were the product vision, or they own the product vision for the company. And I believe they needed to do that for a lot longer. But they had acknowledged themselves that they were no longer the most effective CEO for the company. And if you think about it, that's an incredibly powerful thing. And I think for this conversation, it's worth us unpicking something that my ex-partner, John Coker, used to say, which is that if you look at an org chart for a company, there is no role of founder. Founder is a title that once you start a company can't be taken away from you. You're still the founder of your company, but you're not the CEO of that company. And I think that's a really special thing to acknowledge. And so as a founder, I think you can sort of unpack your role to say, okay, I'm a founder of this business, and I'm a major shareholder in this company. I'm also an employee, and I have the role of CEO, and I'm also probably a board member, which is a different role again. And you have to combine all those things day to day, and you don't think about the segregation, but ultimately they do have different accountability and different responsibility. And so for the founder to be able to, in their role as shareholder and founder, acknowledge that to build the most value in the company, which is ultimately what they want, that they're no longer the right CEO. I think that's a very empowering thing to be able to do, even if it means that they're effectively firing themselves as CEO.
There is one other dimension I'm thinking of here? You mentioned being employed by the company as a CEO, being a shareholder, being a board member, but also there is usually the dimension of friendship, especially between co-founders who went on this journey together and built really deep, meaningful personal relationships that are also part of the conversation.
You raise a great question. Ultimately, building companies is all about people and communication and relationships. It's one of the joys of the role in being around founders and companies is those relationships that we get to build. But ultimately, I think it's very company and person centric as to how those things play out. As the case that the example that I was talking about, I think it takes an extraordinary CEO to come in from the outside and handle those things well and get a good outcome for the company and everyone involved. In the case that I saw there, the incoming CEO absolutely did that, and it was his superpower in that situation, and was able to get the founders into the right roles for them that they could continue contributing real value to the company. But you're right. I mean, it's full of landmines. There's so much context. There's so much relationship dynamics that you're not aware of. We're incredibly imperfect beings, us humans, and so not only is there the co-founder relationship, but there's also the executive board relationship, and then there's the relationship amongst the board, which at that stage of company may be made up purely of investors who have their own relationship dynamics going on and their own fear and greed dynamic going on in terms of where they think the company is at in terms of performance.
But there is one interesting thing you are pointing to. Normally, when we think about the job of a CEO, we think about things like holding the vision, raising the money, hiring amazing people. But you are also pointing to a very specific but critical part of the skill set, managing relationships and being able to rearrange this complex constellation of relationships if they're taking over from a founder CEO, but the founder still stays involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're saying it's the incoming CEO's
Yes.
role to do that, or it's everyone's role to do that?
Well, it's everyone's role to do that. But I think the incoming CEO needs to have it quite clearly on their agenda.
Yeah.
It's not something which will probably happen automatically unless someone pays attention to it.
Absolutely. But I do think it's why the specific situation that we're talking about, where a founder has decided they don't want to be CEO anymore, is the most powerful one, because incentives are fully aligned and they've come to that decision themselves. There's no coercion there. And so they want that transition to be successful.
And if you think about the situation of a founder transition from an investor perspective, I imagine you will need to go back to your partners and explain that the founder that you backed now thinks about stepping down.
So you raise a really important point, which is why I find it so difficult to give one consistent advice to founders in this situation, and why it's so people specific. I've been doing this long enough now to see all sorts of board dynamics play out. And by board dynamics, I mean reactions and behavior from individual board members who happen in a lot of cases to be VCs. And I think it's worth acknowledging that a VC has their own stuff going on when they're turning up to those board meetings. Early on in your career, you have so few data points or investments as an investor that every single one of your investments, you're only one step away from hero or zero in those situations. So if a company's going well and then you step into a board meeting and it's your one star performing company and something's gone wrong, then you can see some really exaggerated behavior from people, because ultimately we're human and everything is driven by fear and greed. So when things are going well, it's great, and that can drive a certain set of behavior. And when things are going badly, that can drive a different set of behavior. And you raised the specific point, which is, I think a lot of people, depending on the partnership they're in, how senior they are, what their track record looks like, how much trust they've got in that partnership, how long they've been in that partnership, all of those things can drive what their fear response. If a founder has a conversation with one of their lead VCs about stepping down as CEO, hopefully, like you and I, would want that VC, or that, because they're in that moment, they're a board member having a conversation with the CEO, and hopefully they've built a trusting partnership with that founder. We want that person to be able to respond and act in the best interest of the company, and the best interest of the company at that stage is to ultimately acknowledge that the founder has made a decision to leave and ensure a successful transition. But what we can then see play out is that board member goes back to their own partnership and they get a whole bunch of different input, or they fear the conversation with their partners because it's going to be perceived that the company is going through a difficult time. And so, yeah, I guess acknowledging the point that we're imperfect, there's fear and greed driving individual decisions and behavior. And I think that's why it's difficult to give one set of consistent advice, because it really does depend on the individual at play. And it's why I think, so I know this is slightly off topic, but it's why you and I have had so many conversations before about coaching and effectively VCs getting their own shit together, because they need to be able to effectively turn up at meetings and not operate from that place of fear and greed, but instead operate from a place of like, we're here to do the best thing for the company, and setting your own issues aside, which is obviously extremely difficult thing to do for anyone in any situation. But I think everyone has to work on themselves to get to that position.
And I imagine it's much more difficult for new fund managers, because when the track record is so short, as you've said, you're one decision away from zero or hero. Whereas if you've got a 15-year track record, it's much easier to feel confident in your decision.
Yeah, you'd expect. I mean, I was trying not in my previous response to sort of knock anyone specifically, but I do think it's probably helpful to touch on a few factors, particularly for anyone listening to this who's interested in what those factors are. I think tenure is really important, and that's not to say there's a direct correlation here between worse behavior or worse reactions from someone with short tenure, but it definitely plays a role. Like early in your career, let's say you're an investor who only makes 2 or 3 investment decisions or investments per year. And so over your first few years, really your investment portfolio, your whole track record could be 5, 6, 7 companies. And at any one time, you're going to have things going well and things going badly. And because of the power law that exists within venture capital, like it's probably only one of those companies, which is your star company. And so tenure, I think, does make a difference, because it directly has a relation on the sort of size of your portfolio. And I found that extremely difficult early in my career. You and I met probably 10 plus years ago, and the job doesn't scale very well. And so every year you think about, how am I going to do more, and how do I scale? It's such a difficult job to do well. How do I continue my personal growth to make sure that I'm doing this well? And when something goes wrong and badly, you really feel it. And so, sorry, I'm talking from experience here, because I think it might help allude to some of the points that you raise. Early on, when things went wrong, I really felt it. I took it home with me. It impacted my decisions, my mood, my behavior, what I said. And then over time, I think you come to some, hopefully, more of an equilibrium, which is, you've been doing this long enough to know there's always something going well, there's always something going badly. And actually, that's not only the reality, but it's the beauty of what we do. Like, you're always dealing with, or always in problem solving mode and trying to help people get the best outcome.
And it sounds like what's really important here is the presence of a trusted relationship between a founder and someone at the board level, be it an early stage investor or a chair, or someone who is trusted enough to handle a potentially complex conversation.
Absolutely. I think trust is key. So if you've got a trusted relationship with a chair or any board member, that's great. But ultimately, everyone is serving the company. Like, as a VC, like, we serve companies. The founders ultimately at some point are serving this company. I say at some point, because when you literally start a company, it can, the founder is the company. These two things are inseparable. But at some point, the company becomes its own thing. It's got multiple stakeholders, customers, suppliers, employees, and all of us are there to serve the company. And so I think trust is important. But ultimately, if everyone needs to believe that they are at each moment doing the right thing for the company. So I very, very rarely feel conflicted on that. Like if I'm in a situation, and I've had one recently where a founder is sharing something with me in confidence and they're still working through a particular decision and they're not ready to share it with the board yet, I feel okay in that situation because I know that the best thing for the company is for the founder to figure that, and in this case, that really difficult thing out first. And it would be not in the company's interests if it's not my obligation suddenly in that situation just to share the news because I've got it and I need to tell every other board member. So the beautiful part is when, the trust and relationships aligns with governance. And for the most part, that is the way I feel all the time. I guess if you do this long enough, you are going to have moments where you feel like something is shared with you that is not in the company's best interests and you need to do something about it. And again, that's a situation where chairs can really help because you can go to the chair with that information and basically they can figure out what to do with it. But yeah, it's for the most, I'm a seed stage investor. For the most part, I don't have chairs and we have to figure that out between ourselves. But again, that comes down to trust, because if the founder has put me in that situation, then it's on me to then go and have a conversation with the founder and say, listen, I've been thinking about this and, you told me this thing, but ultimately, sitting on this thing and not doing anything about it, like, is damaging the company in the meantime. We can't have that. What are we going to do about it? And then work it through with them.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're talking about navigating the responsibility to support the founder and the responsibility to do what's in the best interest of the company.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
But I'm also saying there's a joy that for the most part, those two things are absolutely aligned. But I'm just saying, there may be examples where they're not, and you have to tackle them head on when that exists. But you've touched on something really important to me. The reason I love doing what I'm doing is because ultimately startups don't exist without people. And I love witnessing and experiencing and supporting the human journey that goes on behind building companies. And, having that trusting relationship with founders is like absolutely one of the joys of what I do. So again, I'll come back to the core point. I don't believe you can build successful companies without enabling successful individuals at the heart of those companies. So I've said this to you before, like our role as investors, like we're very good as an industry at putting functional expertise around founders when they're struggling with something, like, here's a marketing expert, here's a growth expert, here's someone to help you with a specific issue. But ultimately, we also need to put the founder in a situation where they can succeed as an individual themselves, which is why I'm such a proponent of coaching, because it's one important tool in the tool belt that we can offer or recommend to founders on that journey.
And if a founder comes to you and shares their thoughts about possibly stepping down, or maybe they say they want to step down for whatever reason, would you ever try to talk them out of the decision? Or in this situation, the founder's intuition is always right?
That's a great one. And no, I would never say never, because I really do think that's situation specific. Have I had one? I don't think I have. So of the three examples that I mentioned at the beginning, one was a situation where the founder had made their mind up or was making their mind up. And actually, I wasn't surprised by it. And ultimately, although I hadn't quite come to the conclusion myself yet, I very quickly did believe that it was the right thing for the company. The second one was different, which is the founder actually coming to me and having a heart-to-heart and acknowledging that they actually were burnt out. They were having a real crisis and they could no longer afford to continue to be the CEO of the company because of the expense of their own health. And that's the one that's just so clear cut for me, obviously. Like, as I said, not only my empathy for them as a founder, because I've been a founder before and I just have so much respect for founders in that position, but also, again, alignment with commercial interests. Like, you can't build a successful company without a successful individual building it. And so if someone's burnt out, like, you need to help them transition as fast as you can. The scary thing is in those situations is obviously that the alternative scenario is that you don't know that they're burnt out and they don't come to you, or that you think they're burnt out, but they're not quite ready to acknowledge that yet. Those would be the different flavors of the same situation. And the third situation I had in mind is much closer to the first one, which is a founder acknowledging they're no longer the right CEO to scale this company. They're no longer able to bring their best self to that role, and they want to work on a successful CEO transition. If somebody came to me and they were just having a really low moment of self-doubt, and Evgeny, we both have acknowledged this in the past. There's the air game and the ground game. The air game is what's going on in the press and what everyone says that they're killing it and building a company is going great. And then there's the ground game, which is day to day. There's all sorts of analogies that we can use here, but it's just unbelievably difficult. Founders really do try and achieve the impossible to build something from nothing, and it can be incredibly hard. And so if someone was a sole founder, or they even had co-founders, but they were all having low moments at the same moment where the CEO was having tremendous self-doubt, if I believe they were still the right person for the job, I would really absolutely have that conversation and try and create the space, or try and create the support that they could work through that decision in an effective way. So, but moving on to the next question around the right and wrong, or good and bad reasons to move on. There's only really two situations where a CEO leaves a company. One is when the CEO decides to leave, and the other is when the board decides the CEO needs to leave. And so I guess that's quite a clarifying framework to think about this through. So if the CEO decides to leave the company, I think there's a few different flavors of that. One is they purely come at it from a commercial perspective, which is I'm no longer the best leader for this company, and I want to continue building as much value in the company as possible, and we need to work on bringing in the right CEO for the stage of the company. The second one falls into the category that I've experienced before, where a founder comes to you and just says, I can no longer afford to be in this role for my own physical or mental health. And I think that's obviously one that we have to take very seriously. And if you're in this industry long enough, you will absolutely see that. And then the third flavor, I think you and I have discussed before, is kind of more unusual, or you might not expect it, but there may be situations where there are just other pressures within the founder's life that mean that they can't continue. But one of them may be financial, for example. So maybe this is getting slightly into the nuance, but you can imagine a company that gets to the point where they're not able to raise any further capital, but ultimately they get to just about break even, but they get to break even through slashing costs, and the CEO is no longer paying themselves a salary, and they get to the point where it's like, well, I've got a family, I can't afford to do this anymore. So that, there may be that, or there may be health reasons, not in their own health, but in their family, or going on. So I think there are totally, legitimate reasons like that. But I guess the one that we've thought about the most would be the situation where the founder decides they're no longer the right leader for the company, or they believe for their own health reasons they can no longer carry on delivering in the way that they need to for the company. Which raises the question of what the wrong reasons are. I don't know, you're putting me on the spot here, but I think if somebody came to me and said, I know we just raised money from you, but actually I've had this better idea and there's another company I want to go and build, like that would go down pretty badly. If somebody said, screw this, I can go make 5 times as much money by working for Google or Facebook, like that would also probably go down quite badly.
When founders face this choice, they often have to navigate complex emotions, often around guilt, along the lines of, I raised money from this fund, I promised, and now for whatever reason, I believe I'm no longer the best CEO for the company. As an external observer, I often think that actually it's great that the CEO recognizes that they are not the best person anymore. It's literally their job to figure out what are the biggest challenges facing the company and taking action, which is what they're doing right now. But I know from my own personal experience of stepping down and from speaking to other founders that this is not how it feels in the moment. Usually there are feelings of guilt and self-doubt.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it comes back to that, my model of a founder I mentioned at the beginning, which is that you envision the founder at the center of this circle with all these stakeholders. And from the outside, it looks like those stakeholders are there to support the founder. And they absolutely do, including the founder's partner at home and their co-founder, the investors, employees. Everyone's rooting for the company and rooting for that founder to be successful. But ultimately, that can also create incredible pressure where you no longer feel like you're the right person to be there. You feel like you're letting all of those people down. But there's two conversations that I like to have with founders on this topic, or remind founders. One is purely to remind them of the commercial relationship or nature of this industry, which is my job as a VC is to invest. We're investing for venture scale outcomes. So, and all of our industry makes so much more sense when you think about everything is driven by the power law, you know. And so I might invest in 25 or 30 companies in a fund, but ultimately 2 or 3 companies will end up driving most of the returns in that fund. And that's what we mean by the power law. And it's just, everyone knows that to be a truism in venture capital. And so taking risk and losing money, whilst it's painful every single time, it is part of our role, and it's part of our industry. And so when a founder in a situation where a slightly different situation, but when they're not being as successful, or they're selling the company subscale, or they're winding the company down, and they feel like there's some obligation there in the sense that we gave them money and they haven't given that money back to us. It's like, I totally respect that. I totally get that. But ultimately, we are in the business of venture capital, of taking a lot of risk. And we do that willingly, like every single time. So, or said it in a more blunt way, we can't make money without losing money. Like it's impossible in our industry. So that's the first conversation. The second one is more around the one that you're touching on, which is I really feel for founders in that moment where they feel that sense of responsibility and feel like letting people down. But ultimately, it's incredibly clarifying when we sit with each other and think about what is our role here. Our role is here to do is the best fit thing for the company. And ultimately, you've come to the conclusion, whether you're no longer the right leader for this company, or whether you can no longer continue to operate because of your own health at the level required for this company, both of those things are counterproductive to company success. So I am absolutely going to support you in that transition and what we need to do next. And it would be, ultimately, that's why I love our industry, because how I want to be and how I want to operate in this industry is very aligned with actually what makes commercial sense. It's sort of a beautiful thing.
And if you think about the next steps once this conversation has started, a founder comes to you, they want to talk about possibly or likely stepping down. How do you think about what's the right thing to do next? Is it a new chief executive? Is it selling the business, an internal promotion, external appointment? What's your mental model or decision tree around what happens next?
I wish I had a mental model or decision tree. So what normally happens, or what has happened in the past, is that the founder, we either meet or they call me, we have this conversation. Obviously, it might be a shock, it might not be a shock. As quickly as possible, I want to move my brain into thinking, if I get over the initial shock, I'm here for the founder, support the founder in that conversation. What do they need from me? Where are they at in their decision-making process? Why are they making this decision? And ultimately, in even that first conversation, we're not making any decisions. We're not coming to any conclusions, I think, but they may want to talk to me to think through scenarios. They've probably been ruminating or thinking about the decision for months. And therefore, when they come to me, they actually kind of probably want some input. And so I want to be able to give them some practical advice on that, give them some examples of what I've been through in the past. But I definitely stay away from making any decisions on that call. And instead, I suggest that we take a couple of days to think about it, and then let's schedule some more time. And the reason I do that is because I actually want to think, in that initial conversation, I want to be there for them. But after that, I want to think about what I think is best for the company, and think about the right steps and stakeholders and what we need to do next. I think it is very legitimate and plausible that the right thing to do next is nothing for a period of a few days, a few weeks, whilst we, depending on where the founder is in their decision-making process. If the founder has absolutely made up their mind and there might be some time-sensitive considerations around this, then we may have to move a bit faster. Like I said, I don't think the automatic response is jumping into, it's not suddenly my duty as a board member to tell everybody else. Like that may be absolutely counterproductive to the situation and therefore counterproductive for the company. So what I would like to do is, again, schedule more time with the founder, go through every scenario, make sure they're clear on, important factors like what the legals say what happens when they step down as CEO, what that means for their board position, what that means for their equity, what they want to do next, whether they want to stay in the company, whether they don't want to stay in the company, whether they believe they need to sell the company or whether they actually want to go through a CEO recruitment process. There could be any number of outcomes here depending on the company stage and depending on what the CEO wants to do.
And Rory, let's look at the other side of the situation. What happens when the investor or the board as a collective reach the conclusion that the founder CEO might need to be replaced?
I'd like to think as an investor and as a board member and as a partner to the founder that I'd earned the right to have that conversation openly with them in a way where I am heard and we have a productive conversation around it. The reality is that early stage investors back founder-led businesses, and it's not to the point at which a company is quite self-sustaining, really, at growth stage, at which an investor would come in with a professional executive team and be able to really get behind. So I don't know, for the sake of argument, let's call that Series B stage and beyond. That's seed and Series A. It's almost unheard of to have a non-founder-led company raising money.
And this is an important point because often when I speak to founders considering stepping down before Series B stage, one of their concerns is that if they give any indication that they're thinking about it, the board will have a knee-jerk reaction and will eject them from the business. Whereas in reality, it's such a high-stakes situation and such a dangerous move that investors see it as a last resort, effectively.
Yeah, I can absolutely confirm that the last thing that a investor wants is for an early stage company to lose the founder and CEO that they backed, unless something tremendous has gone, something's gone tremendously wrong in that situation. I think that fear of the knee-jerk reaction of me exposing myself to the board and saying I'm worried as to whether I'm the right CEO for the company, that resulting in the board turning around and saying, right, you're gone, I think is really unlikely. I'm not saying it's impossible because obviously anything is possible in our industry, but it's definitely not the norm, and I haven't seen it. What's much more likely actually is that the board tries to persuade you to stay or finds out the reason, really tries to dig into the reasons as to why you're leaving. And then when they accept your reasons, they want to work with you on a long transition to make sure they get the right CEO in place. And also that you help support that CEO transition in the best way possible. And again, that's quite situation specific. Like, is it right for the outgoing CEO to stay in the company or not? I think it really depends on the company, the stage, and what that founder's skill sets are. If that founder still owns an important functional area within the business, then absolutely you can find you can create a new role for them that fits in the org chart. If they don't, then it can be more difficult.
And what I'm hearing from you is that this transition from the founder CEO to a new CEO, if it happens, takes considerable time. You mentioned that 12 months earlier in our conversation is one of the examples, and it sounds like it's not a fast process. What's the reasonable time frame that founders need to keep in mind before they commit to stepping down?
I'd love to know the data. I don't know the data. And like I said, I've got sort of three, a sample size of 3. So don't rely on this. But yes, I think it takes longer than we expect. So, and the reason for that is there isn't a deep pool of CEOs that are ready to step into early stage companies. So the later stage the company is, the more well structured, more familiar the company is to a certain type of CEO that's been through that scaling journey before. The earlier stage of the company, the more difficult that is. So I think it depends on the specific situation. But yeah, if it was me and a founder came to me, I would be saying we've got to assume at least 6 months, but probably 12 months for this process to fully run its course. Like the recruitment process itself will probably take 6 months, and getting that person in a role, and then onboarding that person, and transitioning the CEO out and the CEO in is let's call it 12 months.
Yeah. So the conclusion I'm taking from this is that from a founder's perspective, if they are thinking about stepping down, they need to be prepared to keep running the company for at least a year, ideally longer.
That's the ideal situation, but we both need to acknowledge that may not be possible for the reasons that we've outlined. The person, may be burnt out or may need to take some time off. So I know I said this a lot during this conversation, but every situation is different, and it would also depend on whether there might even be an internal candidate that could be interim CEO, for example. I haven't done that before, but that would certainly be a possibility. And so there is not one size fits all approach here. But the ideal for me as an investor is a founder who comes to me with this early enough that they're not in a desperate need to rush out the door, and that we've got time to solve this problem, and that everyone feels like they're pulling in the same direction, and they're pulling in the same direction to do the best thing for the company. And as long as you keep reminding yourself of that, it actually, the decisions just get easier.
And Rory, what you would like founders to know about founder CEO succession from your perspective as an investor?
My heart wants to tell them that this topic is easier once you've said the words, once you've been able to have the conversation with somebody. These things are typically not as scary, and they're way more practical once you've said them out loud and once you've shared them. I think that's just common wisdom for anything that's we might be catastrophizing over. The difficulty with that advice, Evgeny, and I think I've alluded to this before, is I don't think there's a one size fits all approach, because it depends who you're having that conversation with. I would hate to give that advice to somebody, for them to go and have that conversation pretty early before they're really it's a fully formed decision in their mind, and get a bad response from somebody who's connected to the company, whether that's a VC or a board member or anyone else. And so I do think there is absolutely some judgment that needs to be used there. What I'd love to say is, hopefully, if you've built a trusting relationship with a board member or an investor, utilize that relationship and maybe focus on who you have the strongest relationship with, rather than who is the key person around the table that needs to know this news. Because you can get to that key person. It may not be your lead investor. It may be an angel investor. It may be a smaller shareholder. It may be a non-board member. But once you've been able to have this conversation with someone who is knowledgeable, who cares about you, is knowledgeable about the situation, has experience of the industry, and has been through these things before, I think working through this with somebody like that, frankly, and this is not just me promoting you, but I would absolutely introduce somebody. If I knew somebody was working through this, I would absolutely introduce them to you, because no one's thought about this subject as much as you, or has literally written the book on it and has worked with other founders on it. And I think therefore you bring a tremendous wisdom to that, but also a practicality to that, of having seen a number of these situations and thought about these situations. Yeah, that's what I want to know. There are have the conversation, but find the right person to have the conversation with.
And what advice would you give to investors who might be on the board of companies where a founder might be stepping down at some point?
I know this is not intended to sound arrogant. This is not me saying I've got my shit together, but all investors, my advice is we need to get our own house in order. We need to not operate from a place of fear and greed. We need to operate from a place of strong foundations and security around a board table, and always be thinking about what's best for the company. And what's best for the company, as I said, is you can't build these companies without successful individuals. So we need to think about the individuals too. And I think we should all be striving towards that as investors and as board members.
Rory, as we're preparing to wrap up our podcast episode today, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners before we close?
I think there is something here actually around opportunity cost. I think founders do an extraordinary thing, and I love what I do because I get to meet extraordinary people. The most precious thing in a company is the founder's time when they're building that company. But there is also huge opportunity cost of their time, because I believe founders can build multiple companies in their lives. And so I think the worst outcome is when someone stays in a role for longer than they should, whether that's because they've felt loyalty to investors or different stakeholders in the company, or whether they feel shame from leaving the company. So this is me absolutely not advocating for leaving your own company if you don't want to, or when you're just having a difficult day. But if you're in your own company and you want to leave, but you're not leaving because you believe there are reasons not to, I think you need to give that a second look, because the opportunity cost of your time is really, really high as a founder. If you no longer believe you're building value in the company, or if you no longer believe you are the right person to build value in that company.
Sounds like very wise advice based on 15 years of experience in investment.
Let's hope so.
Thank you so much, Rory. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will take a look from it.
Me too. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Evgeny.
Thank you, Rory. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rory today. To conclude, I would like to highlight a few points that Rory made in our conversation. The first one is that it's not a red flag if a founder brings up the topic of CEO succession at the fundraising stage. If they're really ambitious, if they want to build a huge company, if they want it to grow really fast, there is every chance that at some point the company might grow faster than the founding team. It's not a failure, it's a success that the founders built this company, built this rocket ship. And in this situation, a topic of bringing in a new chief executive might well come up. Discussing it at the fundraising stage can come and does come across as the sign of maturity, as Rory explained. Rory also spoke about the importance of trust, building a trusted relationship at the board level that enables a nuanced and complex conversation around CEO succession to happen if it ever arises. And as Rory explained, it's not just on the founder, it's also on the investors. Because investors, we're all human. It's so easy to operate from the place of greed and fear. But investors need to have their own house in order, to do their own work, not to freak out, not to overreact, but instead focus on what's best for the company, what's best for the founder in the moment of CEO transition, so that they can go back to their partnerships and explain what is happening, how everyone is going to navigate it, operating from a place of understanding, feeling grounded, feeling compassion for the founder, instead of focusing on greed and fear because it's so easy to do. Rory also spoke about how important are founders for the business, especially at the early stage. And this is why when a founder raises the question of potentially stepping down, investors are never rushing to eject the founder from the company, because founders are irreplaceable. Quite the opposite. There is every chance that investors will try to persuade the founder to find a way to make it work, because they bring so much to the table. And finally, just before we wrapped up, Rory spoke about how precious the time is for founders and how high is the opportunity cost. Founders can build multiple companies in their career, and if they feel stuck in a job for all the wrong reasons, out of a misplaced sense of guilt or sense of obligation and loyalty to investors, they really shouldn't. They are not doing anyone any favors by doing this. Of course, if a founder CEO wants to stay at the helm for the next 20 years and build a global empire, every investor will be happy to back them. But if a founder doesn't want to do it, then forcing themselves to be in this situation for the wrong reasons is usually the wrong solution. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Please don't forget to like and subscribe on the platform of your choice. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you soon.